Oh, sorry about that. I must have slept through the storm. All right. Today we will be continuing Luke chapter 8. This is the 11th episode in our Gospel of Luke series. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, feel free to check them out for some additional context. I'll leave a link in the description for the series playlist. While there, please consider subscribing to stay up to date as new studies are released. Continuing in chapter 8, we've just examined two of Jesus' teachings, the parable of the sower as well as the parable of the lamp. Now, shifting gears, Luke records several miracles as well, beginning with Jesus calming the storm. Verse 22. Now on one of those days, Jesus and his disciples got into a boat, and he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they launched out. But as they were sailing along, he fell asleep, and a fierce gale of wind descended on the lake, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. Luke begins by setting the scene for the reason that they were on the lake to begin with, prior to the storm coming about. Simply put, because Jesus said to go, stating, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." Though the group would soon find themselves in the midst of a storm, these words from Jesus, in a sense, had proven to be a promise to them that they would cross and arrive on the other side. Furthermore, the lake in question, geographically speaking, was also known as the Sea of Galilee, measuring approximately 13 miles across at its longest. Here, as the group find themselves in the middle of the lake, they encounter a fierce gale, such as was common on that particular body of water, threatening to capsize their vessel. While the disciples would quickly enter a state of panic over the situation, Jesus, however, had fallen asleep. This serves to illuminate a few interesting points for us. Firstly, we see this as a reminder, much as we do in other areas throughout the gospel accounts, that Jesus was truly human. He grew hungry and thirsty. He felt pain and exhaustion, and he even needed sleep, just as we do. It's an important detail that Jesus is able to sympathize with us. He didn't come as some superhuman, but he came as a man, just as we are, leaving the splendor of heaven to take on human flesh. Secondly, it's also fascinating to see that even in the midst of a tremendous storm, he was able to sleep. Rather than being worried about the circumstance they found themselves in, Jesus was at peace, resting in the faith and trust he had in his heavenly Father. For us, in much the same way, when calamity strikes and when we find ourselves in the midst of treacherous storms in life, we can have peace and rest in him, even possibly sleeping through the storm. Verse 24. They came to Jesus and woke him up, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he got up and rebuked the wind and the surging waves, and they stopped, and it became calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" They were fearful and amazed, saying to one another, "Who then is this that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" Clearly, while Jesus was at rest during the situation, the disciples were not. Instead of having faith, trusting in Jesus as he trusted in the Father, they placed more stock in the situation at hand, crying out, "We are perishing." In this cry, we see that the disciples had resigned themselves to what they supposed to be their fate. Their cry was not one of, "Jesus, do something," as if they believed he could calm the storm. Jesus, however, does calm it, rebuking the wind and the waves, exemplifying his power and authority over even the physical elements. He then raises the question to the disciples, "Where is your faith?" At this point in their journey with Jesus, they had seen miracles and healings performed among the multitudes, demons driven out at the very command of the Lord. Why would it be outlandish to believe that he could calm the seas as well? This question, however, echoes to us even today. Where is your faith? Despite whatever life circumstances may be surrounding you at the moment, are you trusting and resting in God's promises and his faithfulness? Or are you leaning on the false hopes and promises of the world? Verse 26. Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when he came out onto the land, he was met by a man from the city who was possessed with demons and who had not put on any clothing for a long time and was not living in a house, but in the tombs. Having now sailed across the Sea of Galilee and through the storm, Jesus and the disciples arrive in the Gentile area of the Gerasenes to be greeted by a man possessed with demons. Of the gospel accounts of demon possession, this particular instance is perhaps simultaneously the most detailed and the most famous. As the text states, the man had been in this state for some time, and his behavior seemed in many ways to be far more animalistic than human. He was unclothed and had seemingly been driven away from civilization and from his home to now dwell among the tombs. Yet, as we'll see, he was precisely the reason for which Jesus had come to such a place, to cleanse and to redeem even this man. Verse 28. Seeing Jesus, he cried out and fell before him and said in a loud voice, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for it had seized him many times, and he was bound with chains and shackles and kept under guard, and yet he would break his bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. The arrival of Jesus prompts the demon to cry out through the man, begging Jesus to leave it alone and to not torment it. This, however, bears a sort of sick irony. While this demon was imploring for Jesus to not torment it, it had been tormenting this man for years. All that said, it's clear from this cry that the demon was well aware of who Jesus is, even referring to Jesus as the Son of the Most High God. This bears a point for us as well. Much like this demon was well aware of who Jesus was, but wasn't submitted to him, we too must be careful to not simply have a head knowledge of Jesus, simply knowing who he is. To do so would be insufficient. We must also know him and submit to him. Interestingly, however, unlike in Luke chapter 4, Jesus did not command the demon to be quiet, whereas in the previous incident, the demon was driven out before a crowd in a synagogue. In this case, it is only Jesus and the disciples that have met the man, much less in the tombs. This drives home the sorrow of the situation. The man truly was alone in the tombs as he was being tormented by these demonic forces. Furthermore, the issue is pressed further that he was removed from society, as the text states that they would often attempt to bind him with chains to restrain him, but he would supernaturally break free from the bonds and be driven into the desert. This exemplifies for us one of the enemy's common strategies. He desires nothing more than to destroy us, and it often begins with isolation and desperation. On the other hand, while the townspeople refused to associate with him for safety reasons or otherwise, Jesus' concern was for the man first and foremost. He was willing to venture into a backwater Gentile location, all to seek out and rescue this one from torment. In certain ways, this should serve as encouragement for us. Just like he was so driven by compassion that he was willing to go to great lengths to rescue and redeem this one, so is he also willing to reach out for us even in the midst of sin and turmoil, to rescue us and redeem us from the powers of darkness. Verse 30. And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They were imploring him not to command them to go away into the abyss. Now there was a herd of many swine feeding there on the mountain, and the demons implored him to permit him to enter the swine. And he gave them permission, and the demons came out of the man and entered the swine. And the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. Another way in which this particular demon possession proves to be unique within the pages of Scripture is included here. The demon's name. Furthermore, that it even had a name. In a certain way, much like a threatened animal, the demons refer to themselves as legion. The attempt was to communicate that there were many of them, as if that would disarm or otherwise intimidate Jesus. Yet he was undeterred, and seemingly upon realizing this, they began to implore him not to command them to go into the abyss. In doing so, we see that not only were they well aware of who Jesus was, but also the power and authority he held. While not much is fully known or understood about the place referred to, we do see it referred to in multiple locations throughout the book of Revelations, such as chapters 9 and chapter 11. Revelations chapter 20, verse 1 through 3 also gives us an idea of the purpose of this abyss or this bottomless pit. Let's take a look. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. So in essence, it appears to be a place that it's intended for the restraint and imprisonment of demonic spirits, even eventually Satan himself. We can be encouraged, however, knowing and seeing that the forces of evil and darkness will one day be done away with, defeated by the very power of God. As another point of emphasis regarding Jesus' power and authority, even over the spiritual and demonic entities in question, the demons apparently required permission to inhabit the pigs. While Luke's account doesn't mention the number of swine in particular, we know from Mark's record in Mark chapter 5, verse 13, that this was no small herd. In fact, it proved to be some 2,000 pigs in total. And now the entire herd had drowned in the sea. Verse 34. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they ran away and reported it in the city and out in the country. The people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone out, sitting down at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it reported to them how the man who was demon-possessed had been made well, and all the people of the country of the Gerasenes and the surrounding district asked him to leave them, for they were gripped with great fear. And he got into a boat and returned. As a result of this miracle, the herdsmen of the pigs ran to report the incident to those in the city. As a result, they come to see for themselves what had happened, only to discover the man who they formerly witnessed in a demon-possessed state, clothed and right-minded. This is the same man that, prior to the arrival of Jesus, was living essentially as an animal, unable to be bound by even chains and restraints. Yet when Jesus became involved, the man was returned to a correct state of mind and behavior. Jesus had just performed a tremendous miracle. And yet, the townspeople didn't seem to be especially excited. In fact, as the text states, they asked him to leave them, for they were gripped with great fear. Considering the large size of the herd of pigs, it's quite possible that this small locale's economy was heavily influenced by raising these animals, and Jesus, through cleansing the man, had just allowed them all to be run into the sea. The reaction wasn't to praise or even thank Jesus for healing the man and setting him free. Instead, they were afraid of the ramifications of this healing, how it would affect their bottom line, and so they implored Jesus to leave. And so he did. Verse 38. But the man from whom the demons had gone out was begging him that he might accompany him. But he sent him away, saying, "Return to your house and describe what great things God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. Unlike the townspeople, the man's reaction was a desire to follow after Jesus, undoubtedly in gratitude for what he had done for him. Yet Jesus sent him away. On the surface, the first reaction may be to think of this as cruel. Why wouldn't Jesus allow him to follow him? This man, however, had an important testimony both to tell and to live before the people of the Gerasenes, this same group who had just asked Jesus to leave. Furthermore, this man was now able to return home, quite possibly to reunite with his family, who would now see what the Lord had accomplished in him. Verse 40. And as Jesus returned, the people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. As the Gospel of Luke progresses, so it seems also that the size of the crowds following Jesus progresses and grows as well. The people at this point continue to be enamored by Jesus, and so they swarm him and the disciples as a result. The swarming was so great, in fact, the text states that they were pressing in against him. The Greek word used to describe this multitude is also the same word earlier in chapter 8, verse 7, as Jesus is describing the choking of the seed of the word of God in the parable of the sower. In other words, the crowd was so thick it was almost suffocating. In the midst of all the chaos and commotion, Jairus comes and he beseeches the Lord to come and heal his daughter. This is of particular significance because, as the text states, Jairus was an official of the synagogue, a position that would be akin to that of a pastor to those of us in modern culture. And while this wouldn't necessarily make him especially affluent, it did position him as a spiritual leader in that region. And yet he comes desperately seeking to save the life of his only daughter. And this seeking, he finds himself at the feet of Jesus, his last hope. On Jesus' part, we don't see any questioning. He simply goes where he is needed. And even with the, in many ways, inconvenience of the crowds pressing in around him. However, as he goes, he's interrupted in this process of coming to help. Verse 43. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. And immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone did touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out of me." In the midst of this tremendous crowd pressing in on Jesus from all sides, this woman who had been afflicted by a hemorrhage for 12 years approaches him from behind and touches the fringe of his cloak. Much like Jairus, this woman was at a point of desperation. The particular condition that she was enduring, it was such that it would have caused her to be unclean both ritually and socially. Furthermore, if she were to come into contact with anyone, they would be considered to be unclean as well. And yet she risks everything, braving the crowd in the hope that she might be healed by Jesus. Beyond and somewhat because of being considered unclean, she would undoubtedly be desperate from the ostracization and stigma surrounding what she experienced. Depending on her age, it's possible that she may have not married, and certainly had she married prior to experiencing this issue, it's unlikely that she could have even borne children. All in all, this medical condition was touching and impacting multiple facets of her life. The text states that she could not be healed by anyone. One can easily imagine that over the course of her 12-year affliction, she had physician after physician attempt to remedy and to treat her condition to no avail. Instead, it was only when she came into contact with the great physician himself that she experienced freedom from her ailment. For us, we may face ailments of our own, even spiritual in nature. Perhaps you're enduring addictions or you're struggling with sin. You've tried every remedy that the world has offered and suggested. You've tried with your best effort to lay that sin aside, but no matter what you try, you can't seem to have victory over it, and you remain entangled. The spiritual physicians of this world have failed you by providing self-help, power of positive thinking, and false guidance. Thankfully, our hope doesn't end with this world. We need to come to a place of desperation where we seek out the great physician, Jesus Christ, so that we can receive true freedom through him. Verse 47. When the woman saw that she had not escaped, notice she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Upon her touching his garment and receiving healing, Jesus was well aware that power had gone out from him. She didn't receive healing and then escape as she had perhaps planned, possibly due to the embarrassment and the stigma mentioned earlier. So she fell down before him, trembling as it states in the text, possibly afraid of the ramifications or concerned that Jesus would be harsh with her. Again, she was ceremonially unclean, and by touching Jesus under normal circumstances, it would make him unclean as well. Yet much as we see in our lives, when we bring our uncleanness to him, it doesn't make him unclean. Instead, he purifies us and makes us clean, washed and sanctified in him. Seeing her faith that drove her to seek him and to seek him out and to seek his healing, Jesus doesn't scold her or reprimand her. Instead, he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Verse 49. While he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But when Jesus heard this, he answered him, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe, and she will be made well." One can imagine Jairus' natural reaction being to become somewhat distraught over this news that had been brought to him. He had come and he brought Jesus to heal his daughter, only for her to die while they were en route to her. One can easily imagine that the thought prevailing for Jairus that had they not been interrupted by the woman moments ago, had Jesus not been delayed, his daughter might have lived. Jesus, however, had a different plan and purpose in mind, reassuring Jairus, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe and she will be made well." In essence, Jesus was telling him, even though things seem more grim now than they were, you believed that I had the power to heal her. Don't cease believing that I am able to heal, to make her well even now. Despite everything else pointing to the idea that all hope was lost, Jesus encourages him to believe, not in the situation nor the circumstances surrounding it, but to believe in him. And at this point, faith in Jesus was all he had. Thankfully, it's all that he needed. Verse 51. When he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the girl's father and mother. In this, we see the first incident recorded in the Gospel of Luke in which Jesus permits a select group of his disciples to witness one of his miracles. Peter, James, and John, in a way, they form a sort of inner group witnessing some of the most miraculous events in Jesus' life and ministry firsthand. The text states that he also permitted the girl's father and mother, that being Jairus and his wife, to enter with him as well. Verse 52. Now they were all weeping and lamenting for her, but he said, "Stop weeping, for she has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. He, however, took her by the hand and called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up immediately. And he gave orders for something to be given to her to eat. Her parents were amazed, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. As they enter the home, immediately they are met with mourners weeping over the situation regarding this child who had passed. And yet Jesus states to them, "Stop weeping, for she has not died, but is asleep." Jesus had a plan and a purpose, not fixating on the girl's state at that present time, but knowing and seeing the miracle that would soon take place. As he reaches out to the girl, taking her by the hand, he tells her, "Child, arise." And immediately her spirit returned to her. Jesus, reflective of the character of God, breathing life into that which is dead, being the resurrection himself, spoke into the death which had taken hold of the girl and returned to her that which only he could give her, life. What a beautiful picture of our salvation. Even in the midst of our sin and death, Jesus reaches out to us, not stopping at what he sees in the present, but knowing what he can accomplish in our future. And he declares to us, "Child, arise." Through our responding to his call, we are resurrected and given new life in him. So this brings us to the end of Luke chapter 8. Next time in chapter 9, we'll be examining Jesus' transfiguration. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay up to date as we continue studying together. Thanks for watching.